Hey everyone, Ariel Adams here with the Superlative Podcast. Please listen to the other aBlogtoWatch podcast, aBlogtoWatch Weekly, where we go over the latest watch news and reviews. Today, my guest on Superlative is Garrin Fraze. He is a watchmaker, an educator, and a content creator. Garrin, welcome.
Thanks, Ariel. I'm really happy to be here.
Garrin, so I think a good place to start is to sort of just rattle off the various roles, jobs, things you do, responsibilities you've given yourself within the field of watches and watchmaking. I think that's sort of a good start to help people understand how to understand what you do.
Sure. So my full-time gig is as the program coordinator for the Paris Junior College Watchmaking Program. I'm part instructor and part director of the program, so I keep that program motoring along, set up visitors, set up field trips, give lectures, give demonstrations, help the students however I can. And then on my personal time, I service watches, mostly vintage, out of this workshop that you see me in now, and I try to make educational content out of those watches that I service. Try to do one video a week for Instagram, but sometimes I do a little more, sometimes a little less.
So if you could choose any one of those things and do only that thing full time, which one of those things would it be?
It would be the education. I feel like that's such an important part of this industry and something that's really at risk right now. There's a lack of watchmakers, but there's an even greater lack of educators and educational opportunities. So I see I see the role of program coordinator at Paris Junior College is like my number one priority.
A lot of people in the industry know about what is, we'll just call it sort of the watchmaking crisis or the watchmakers crisis. It's a dynamic and complicated issue. A lot of people, especially those who just got in the industry in the last 5 or 10 years, especially, collectors and hobbyists may not really understand this until they've actually tried to get stuff maybe fixed or spoken to someone like you. Give a macro level view at how you see the watchmaker's problem. We'll talk about maybe what's being done about it, but what is the issue in general?
So in general, the issue is that there's far more watches that need service and repair than there are qualified professional watchmakers and technicians to carry out the service and repair of those watches. So my job as the program coordinator at PJC is to produce more watchmakers to help solve that problem. And we're doing everything we can to make sure that we produce high quality, skilled watchmakers and technicians and get them into the industry where they can make a difference and contribute to this problem.
Now, one element that created this problem, there's more than one element, is something that people, of course, can understand. Watchmaking as a trade requires a certain level of jobs, or else there isn't going to be sort of this educational industry to support it, right? Like schools tend to want to, I know you can argue about how good it is these days, but they want to create people that have jobs for them. You know, there aren't a lot of people going into the equestrian arts because we don't ride horses every day, right? And at some point, there'll be less people who are specialists in combustion engines because we'll have electric motors and stuff like that. Watchmakers during much of the 20th century was obviously a really important job, right? Like people needed their watches fixed. They didn't have a bunch of them. There weren't a ton of things to tell the time. It was, in a way like an electrician or a plumber or some type of necessary tradesperson. And because watchmaking is complicated, there's all these schools and, of course, culture around it. And some of them are obviously more advanced than others. But you could go out there and get a watchmaker's education. Now, the situation is very different. Watchmaking exists as a hobby, as a luxury. And there's a lot less what you call practical-minded people that go into watchmaking. Some people are fortunate and live in a part of the world like around France and Switzerland where there are watchmaking schools, and they might hear about it from a young age and recognize like that's an industry that seems to consistently hire. But that's a relatively small number of people and a relatively small number of schools. So that's the practical side of it, of why there's not that many watchmakers and why you have to create a resurgence in watchmaking schools. And that's an admirable thing. But again, you sort of mentioned a junior college and sort of rural Texas. That's where some of these programs are. There's no watchmaking school anywhere near Los Angeles, for example, right? Like nothing like that.
The closest one to Los Angeles would be Seattle Watch Technology Institute at Seattle Technical College, and that's a great program. But you're right; they're very few and far between.
Yeah, I mean that's that's you can't drive to that. That's 2 states away, right? That's basically across the country. Then the second part of it is a different problem, which is that watchmakers who go through the programs today and get the education have difficulty in making a living, which is ironic given how many watches there are out there that need to be serviced. And there's a variety of weird reasons for this. For example, brands not wanting to sell parts, wanting to do the repairs themselves, watchmaking education being limited to certain limited technical roles as opposed to a more holistic approach to understand watchmaking theory and math all the way to fabrication, repair, and stuff like that. What am I missing? I mean, again, I'm not a watchmaker. This is what I pieced together as an observer.
So I think what you're missing is a little bit of the current situation. There's been a lot of change recently. So you mentioned there's just not a lot of people that are interested in getting into watchmaking, and that's not really the case anymore. We have a skyrocketing demand for our program. We've got a waiting list of about 2 years right now. So there's like I think there's 75 students on the waiting list right now. So there's plenty of students that want to get into those schools. It's just a matter of having positions available for them, right? So we only have so many schools. If we had more schools that were able to train qualified watchmakers, then those watchmakers would be able to, or those students that are on the waiting list right now, they'd be able to get in quicker. So part of what we're trying to do at PJC right now is expand the scale of our program so we can take on more students at a time. We just hired a second instructor. We're working on hiring an assistant instructor. So we'll have a team of 3, and then that way we can increase our max class size up to 24 concurrent students in 2 separate classrooms. And then another thing that I think is changing for the better is the compensation. I think a lot of major brands, I think a lot of independent, jewelry store situations, they're starting to recognize the value of a watchmaker, and so the starting salaries that we see our graduates getting has been increasingly going up and up and up. So it's not unusual to see graduates from our program start in a role where they're getting $70K plus and benefits and all that, and then in just a couple years get 2, maybe even 3 raises and be making a really comfortable living within 2 years of graduating the program. So I think there's a lot of positive momentum, but I don't think that means we can just stop and take a break. I think the industry still needs us educators to do as much work as we can. So I'm working really hard to help contribute to the solution for this problem still. So yeah, I think it's, in summary, I think it's on the way up. It's getting better.
Yeah, that's excellent. Of course, I'm familiar with a lot of the newer initiatives, and I knew that it was people were interested in it. I'm glad, so good to hear that that's also been your experience. But as you said, there's still a lot of pieces of the puzzle that need to be built for this all sort of to make sense. And one of the weird things is the fact that right now, as it stands, the interests of a watchmaker and the interests of a watch brand are not exactly the same. There's a bit of a conflict of interest in some regards there. And so what you have is this weird situation where much of the watch industry is not an American industry. It's a foreign industry. And that foreign industry has said, well, most of the watchmaking and watch repair, we want to keep that back home. What we'll do is we'll do the bare minimum when it comes to different parts of the world, the United States, for example, in doing just a service which is easy and capable there, which is replacing parts, not full watchmaking, and sort of this limited approach where we protect, all the really good stuff back home. And then the interest of the locality, which is, people don't want their watches sent back to Switzerland or Japan all the time. People don't necessarily want to pay that one price. People want to be able to price shop. Competition, of course, is, I think, really, really important. When brands dictate pricing, then you don't have competition. And, think about if you only had one watch to buy. People like to buy Rolexes in a vacuum as though that's it. But the reality is there's tons of stuff. So watchmaking is at its most healthy, in my opinion, when it's competitive. And I think a lot of people agree. And watchmaking companies don't agree, and they have a different idea behind it. So the weird thing is that for there to be a robust watchmaking culture in the United States, I think, and I'm sure you'll agree, you can't rely on the foreign companies to do that. It needs to be a homegrown initiative, but of course it has to be synergistic, very, very synergistic with these foreign companies. And that's, frankly, just a lot of politics and trial and error.
Yeah, there's absolutely a lot of politics in the watchmaking industry in regards with, working with the foreign brands. I think that it's kind of a double-edged sword because as an educator, I'm not the only. I think it's fair to say that most, if not all, watchmaking schools get some level of support from the Swiss watch industry. We have a lot of support from brands that would prefer that I don't mention their name, and so I'll respect that. But they help us out a lot by providing equipment, by sending trainers to give our students exposure to those brands. But we also have this growing group of independent American watchmakers who are also supporting us more and more. So I've been in contact with a lot of great up and coming American brands and American watchmakers, and so there's support for watchmaker education from all sides of the industry. Now, as far as what you mentioned about the big European companies and Japanese companies kind of minimizing what's done here in the States, I have to be a little bit careful and diplomatic about what I say. But yeah, there's a lot of technicians that they need in their service centers to do the quick repair and service of the modern calibers, which often means movement swaps, which means part swaps, which means less than complete watchmaking, right? So one technician who goes to work in a service center may get really good at putting the dial and hands on a watch. Another technician may get really good at doing the encasing. Another technician may get really good at overhauling the movement, and another may get really good at timing, like doing the timing adjustments. But they're not doing everything all together. Whereas if you go to a jewelry store and you're an independent watchmaker who has parts accounts with these major brands, then you have access to their spare parts. You're trained by them on the way they like to do things. And then you do the entire process. So you'll provide the estimate, break down the watch, service the watch, refinish the case if the customer wishes to have their case refinished, reassemble, do all the adjustments yourself, quality control yourself. So there's, I feel like there's a little bit of a misconception about exactly how much control the Swiss have over, how their watches are handled here in the United States. But they do want to have some say in how their watches are handled, and who can blame them? They've spent decades and decades building these brands and this reputation. And so for someone who's less than qualified to work on their watch, do a poor job, and then that customer has that reputation of that brand, when actually that watch could be running a lot better because it wasn't serviced by someone who is qualified. Well, if I were one of those big brands from Switzerland, I would probably try and maintain the reputation of my brand however I could. Now, there's absolutely a conversation to be had about whether how they're going about doing that is fair, or if it's going to be the best thing for the industry in the long run. But I don't think you can really blame them for trying to control their brand image.
It's a very complicated topic, absolutely. And you're right. This final argument they have about trying to maintain quality and stuff like that is persuasive. With that said, it's also shaky because you know that brands often have a reputation for, unless they're highly motivated, doing repairs in a more shoddy way than an independent person. And so while, yes, there are examples of independent watchmakers doing things that they should not be doing because it's beyond their skill level, it's actually more often the case that brands are the ones that are most guilty of fumbling work.
I'll share with you the phrase that my students probably get the most tired of, which is "it depends." It always depends on what brand are we talking about, what technician are we talking about, what watchmaker are we talking about? Because there's a lot of really, really excellent independent watchmakers, and there's a lot of really excellent watchmakers working in service centers, and there's management, whether it's in a jewelry store or a service center or wherever, that demands these type of results instead of the best results, right? So in the classroom at PJC, I teach my students to work to a standard of excellence so that they know they are capable of it. And then if they go somewhere and a manager or some suit tells them, hey, this is really great work, but it took too much time and blah, 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 or whatever. If they're asked to work to standards that they are not comfortable with, well, they have the skills to go work somewhere that holds excellent standards. So that's my goal, is to always produce watchmakers who have excellent standards so that wherever they go, they're doing excellent work. And if they're forced by management to do less than excellent work, well, they have the tools and the know-how to go elsewhere and do work of which they are proud.
A lot of content creators these days who do watchmaking stuff seem to also be autodidacts, meaning they're trying to teach themselves for better or worse.
Right.
And, I have to ask myself, how wise is this? On the one hand, there's no way that you can always teach yourself the same as an informal education. You're going to miss stuff, terminology, common statements, measurements. There's just stuff you're going to miss. With that said, some of history's most famous watchmakers, in small or large part, were self-taught, especially modern ones with restoration and stuff like that. My question is, what is your opinion and what is your message to those people who would follow watchmakers who are either professionally trained or autodidacts?
Sure. I will be, again, as careful and diplomatic with my answer as I can be.
You don't need to be.
but I know. Many watchmakers who are professionally trained and do good work see a lot of the content that is made by self-taught hobbyists, and it physically pains us to watch hobbyists work on watches at times, because there are just things that they don't know, they have never learned, they've never had the opportunity to learn properly. And a lot of the time it's not their fault. I can't blame anyone for wanting to learn watchmaking. It's an excellent profession. I don't think it makes a good hobby. That's just my personal opinion. If you do want to take up watchmaking as a hobby, I think that is totally fine, so long as you are working on your own watches. The moment you start taking on customer work and start charging people money, that's where it gets to me to be a little bit morally questionable, because part of learning watchmaking is making mistakes. I don't know a single professional watchmaker who has not made a very costly mistake. And sometimes if you're working on a watch for a customer and you're not making your mistakes and learning from them in school, you make those mistakes on a customer's watch. And to me, that's it's really morally questionable for sure. So to people who watch hobbyist watchmakers on YouTube or Instagram or wherever, do not take that as a true representation of the watchmaking industry and what professional watchmakers do. It is not a good representation of our industry.
I hear you.
I'll cut myself off there, but I have been.
You have strong feelings. That's good. I can tell.
And lots of professional watchmakers also have strong feelings about this. I've spoken with.
Look, I went to law school. If somebody was trying to practice law, is I watched a bunch of videos, read books, I could figure this out. I'd be like, you're missing something. But here's the difference between maybe a legal profession and the watchmaking profession. While there are, of course, certificates and things like that, there's no legal requirement in anywhere in the United States that I know of, maybe in other parts of the world, that you have to be a certified watchmaker to offer watchmaking services. So ostensibly, anyone can offer to repair your new or old watch and have no formal education, and there's no legal remedy. Maybe fraud if they say they did, right? Sure. But that's something to check. I know it sounds dumb, but like, has your watchmaker gone to watchmaking school? Depending on the job, of course, as you said, it depends. But depending on the job, that's probably a good pre-qualification.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say so for sure. Like anything that's I would consider a high value timepiece. So like historical vintage timepieces, major brands, like something that's a luxury watch, I would be very careful sending that to anyone who does not have professional education. Now, I know I will probably get some pushback from hobbyists. I know a lot of my community, a lot of my followers on Instagram are hobbyist watchmakers, and they're trying to, learn what they can from me. And I'm absolutely happy to share as much of my knowledge as I can with anyone who asks. But if you're going to try and teach yourself watchmaking, learn on your own watches, and learn from your own mistakes on your own watches, and really, if you're interested enough to pursue it as a hobby, genuinely, what is stopping you from becoming a watchmaker, from pursuing it professionally? There's, we were talking earlier about how few educational opportunities there are. Sometimes that's that's the prohibiting factor that's preventing people from becoming full-fledged watchmakers. But if you have access, if you have the means, if you have the time, and you're interested in this, just go to school for watch. Like there's 1 year customer service watchmaking programs at Swatch and Richemont, and then you can go work for Swatch and Richemont directly. You can work on Omegas, you can work on Cartiers, you can work on Jaeger-LeCoultre, Vacheron Constantin, like the Breguet. These are all brands under the Swatch and the Richemont umbrella. So if you really want to learn how to work on watches, it takes a year or two to enter this industry professionally with some formal education. So
could you ever
what's
have
stopping you?
Like a weekend type of thing? Because obviously, yes, people can relocate for a couple years and do this, but they basically have to change everything. Very few people can do that. Wouldn't it make sense if in close to big cities, there was, again, weekend courses where you could do all that stuff, just not have to pause your entire life for it?
Sure. So there are some of these types of courses that exist. The Horological Society of New York does their traveling. I think it's a 1 week kind of like Watchmaking 101 introduction to watchmaking. The AWCI hosts classes all the time throughout the year, like 1 or 2 week long classes, mostly in Ohio, but they also have like a traveling workshop where they'll do sort of the same thing. And so I think if that's something where you're kind of like trying to determine if this is an industry that you really want to pursue, that's a great way to get started. And then
I'm just seeing a business opportunity for like a full-on watchmaking course that you do more slowly, but over like nights and weekends or something like that. Like, you're right about those little traveling things, but you've done those. It just gives you a little taste. Whatever you learn, you can't really apply anywhere. You got to do it consistently, learn all the things. Like, I think that would be a very successful thing. Look, it's a business opportunity because I think a lot of hobbyists, as you said, would like it because it would enhance their ability to understand it. It's not like they'd have to go to like car mechanic school if they're into cars. This is more accessible. And then the other side, and this is, again, just thinking as a business person in this industry, isn't there a lot of money to be made off the tools? Because I think of men in their garage. They want a bunch of tools they don't use. Watchmaking is the same way. It's all about little tools, very specific. I feel like the guy that just sort of wants to pretend once in a while rather than do the courses, he's gonna get the watchmaker's desk. He's gonna get the light. He's gonna get all the different screwdrivers, different tweezers. Like, I feel that there needs to be more companies that are set up to sell to that type of consumer who is, we'll call it a pro hobbyist. Like, clearly isn't going to be working on other people's watches, but like wants to feel like they can do it. Yeah, maybe they're never going to use the table saw really, but they want to own it.
Yeah, there's plenty of individuals like that, and there's
I met them. I know.
there's a handful of companies that do cater to those individuals, and I think it's again,
in the
it's
US?
one of those. There's one at least that I know of off the top of my head that is like exactly what you just described.
I'm glad there's one at least.
Yeah, and then there's eBay sellers. There's the major supplier, like the people that I buy my tools from. You just have to set up an account. You can buy your tools from them as well. So
yeah, but like Bergeon isn't going to like take the time to say like, here's the kit for the guy at home.
Right.
Like they're used to selling to companies that know what they need.
There's so at Jules Burrell, there's a gentleman named Stanley McMahon who was my instructor at Paris Junior College, and he actually, when he retired from teaching, he's the one who asked me to take over the program, and he went on to now work as the operations manager, I think is his title, at Jules Burrell, and he's working on setting up something like that where it's like the introductory toolkit, the getting started toolkit. But then there's another company, I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but they're basically exactly what you're describing. They have toolkits for hobbyists just getting started, just getting into it. And I think stuff like that is great, but again, it's a double-edged sword because hobbyists like this increased demand for tools and equipment has driven up the price of a lot of the tools and equipment that professionals use and made not only the hobby more prohibitively expensive to get into, but the profession more expensive to be engaged in. And so if you're an independent watchmaker, now the cost of your equipment, your starting out cost has increased, and it's cutting into your bottom line if you're a independent watchmaking business owner of some sort. So it's like, on the one hand, I think it's great because it gets more people into this industry, which we absolutely desperately need. But it also just drives up the price of everything, which is,
basically the same thing with watches. A lot of the used watches, nobody cared about them. Now there's a lot more demand, and you have to find, at least with watches, there's always the unknown options. With watch tools, there's aren't like a bunch of unknown companies you just bypass, right?
There's a few companies that us watchmakers kind of, we know that, and we kind of gatekeep a couple of companies, and don't ask me about them because I won't tell you. It's our secret.
No, I won't. I'm glad you have that. Now, this era of being public with watchmaking is kind of an interesting thing. On the one hand, there seems to be some latent consumer interest in how stuff is made, right? So anything which is an artisanal thing that shows how things are made works really well for online content. So there's that. And then there's this sort of other element where it helps understand value. Why are these things so expensive? Stuff like that. So there's this weird thing where the public, while they're not really interested in watchmaking, are sort of interested in watchmaking content.
Sure.
But traditionally, watchmaking has been a pursuit for mostly introverts who, in Switzerland, the watchmakers wouldn't be categorized as the social creatures. What was it in your personality that allowed you to focus very much on this technical pursuit, but also adding a very, I guess you could say, personal, element to it where you're communicating about it to as many people as you can?
Great question. I force myself to get in front of a camera. It doesn't come naturally. I am very much a typical watchmaker who is a little bit more introverted. Kind of like generally in my personal life, I keep to myself. I spend most of my free time in this room working on watches, and the content did not come naturally. I started with like ASMR, so like I wasn't showing my face. It was just the watches, and then I started showing my face, but I wasn't talking. And it's only recently, after I became a professional educator, that I actually started doing more of the dialogue and the scripting and everything. So it's not really something that was inherently there in my personality. It's just something that I kind of like worked on and practiced and just slowly but surely got better at. And now I've got this, small, but for the watchmaking industry, relatively large following of people who are either watchmakers themselves, hobbyists, enthusiasts, or just people who are interested in how things work and how, repair, restoration, and all that good stuff. So, good question.
Citizen Watch celebrates the 40th anniversary of the seminal Aqualand diving tool with a brand new limited edition timepiece. In 1985, prior to the availability of most wearable dive computers, Citizen released the first Aqualand wristwatch that was meant to combine a wearable sports timing tool with a useful, precise electronic depth gauge for recreational and professional diving purposes. The Aqualand family of products eventually developed into Citizen's now iconic ProMaster family of utility-driven watches and represents a style that has been worn by enthusiasts for well over a generation. The 2025 limited edition Citizen ProMaster Aqualand 40th anniversary model honors the iconic Aqualand profile, including an analog digital dial display, an attached pressure sensor module on the left side of the 200-meter water-resistant steel case, and a comfortable diver's-style strap that can easily be worn over a wetsuit. Citizen has further modernized the classic Aqualand with new underwater timing and depth tracking features. Novices to the Aqualand universe and enthusiasts alike can pick up this limited edition Citizen for just $595 while supplies last. Learn more at citizenwatch.com. Do people on a regular basis solicit you to repair their watches? Obviously, they're willing to pay you, but is that content creation at all good for getting business in a stable way? Like, I imagine once in a while, but is it a stable way of getting business?
Yeah, I don't advertise my services, and a lot of the time when people, DM, I do get a lot of people DMing me saying, "Hey, can you service this? Can you service this?" And a lot of the time I'll say no. I probably say no more often than I say yes, but every now and then I get a really cool watch or a really cool request. So like recently, I just sent out a LeCoultre wrist alarm, like a pre-Memovox wrist alarm from the 50s. And that was just a really cool watch that I wanted to service.
That must have been fun.
It was a lot of fun. It was great. I had not serviced an alarm watch before, and so it was a good learning opportunity and a really cool watch to service. Yeah, I get a lot of interest, but because teaching takes up so much of my time, I don't really, I spend maybe 20 hours a week here in the shop servicing watches. And I'm very picky about the work that I take on. So it's a great. I think if I were to ever move away from teaching and just go on to service and repair exclusively, I could probably pay the bills from if I start advertising my services on Instagram, because I think people like to see the process of servicing their own watch. A lot of these, vintage watches, especially, which is what I mostly focus on in this shop, don't have display case backs. The customer never sees the movement. So to see not only the movement itself, but everything broken down, like I had to make a part for that LeCoultre, and I sent a picture of the part that I made to the customer. They loved it. It was great. So I think that kind of glimpse into the process is something that a lot of people really, really look for and really appreciate. And I think watchmakers moving forward, independent watchmakers at least, are kind of catching on to exactly that. And so the content that they share on Instagram, if they share content at all, is more and more glimpses into what goes into servicing watches.
It seems that most watchmakers, just given their personalities and practicality, prefer to work for a boss, so to say, a watchmaker or a brand, because much of what they need to do is sort of done for them. They're just given workloads and they understand, where they need to excel. But there seems to be more and more total independents who, like you, have to do content creation, manage customer service, buy parts, maintain a desk, and all that stuff. Is that a sustainable thing for one person to do, or is it really a multi-person job?
Well, it depends on the person. It depends on the workload. It depends on the type of work they're doing. I think it's sustainable for me just because I say no so often. I think an important part of being an independent watchmaker is knowing what kind of niche you want to focus on, knowing the type of customer you want to deal with, and knowing when to say no. Because there's some like I could make a contract with a bunch of different vintage watch dealers and service however many watches, and I would probably get paid less than I want for more work than I can handle with shorter turnaround times than I can manage. Or I can take on individual clients one at a time, charge them what I know my work is worth, take the amount of time that I need to, and deal with an understanding client who cares about the watch that I'm servicing and wants to see excellent results, and they want me to take the time that it takes to achieve those excellent results. So that's really like, that's what I try to focus on. Now, other watchmakers who are independent, they're less of an independent watchmaker and more of an independent service center, where they're expanding to take on all these different brands. They've got tons of parts accounts with different brands. They hire other watchmakers, end up with like a team of 6 or 8, and then they're servicing tons of watches, right? And so it depends on what you want. Like, what's your goal? Like, if I wanted to just like make as much money as I could, I would probably open a service center and hire other watchmakers and just service as many watches as I possibly could. But that's not my MO. I'm not really like trying to become rich off of this. I really enjoy watchmaking. I really enjoy teaching others about watchmaking and sharing my passion. And so, the watches that I get to service in this workshop are kind of like the icing on the cake. That's just bonus on top of being an educator and sharing this passion with my students and my followers. So
now, are you also a restorer? And I think before you answer, I think it's important to say what that means. Watch repair is fixing a broken watch. Watch restoration can involve fixing a watch, but also involves making it look newer again, fixing cosmetic elements, sometimes making it look brand new or close to brand new, or sometimes just, fixing things that just, don't look good anymore. You'll agree that watch restoration, watch repair, while related, it's sort of 2 levels of things, right?
Absolutely.
And are you also a restorer, or are you mostly focused on watch repair?
So I have the skill set to be a restorer. When I worked at Haltom's Jewelers in Fort Worth, Texas, it's a Rolex ORJ now that is now shut down. When I was working on Rolexes there, I would consider myself a restorer because I did laser welding, I did refinishing. We would part of the Rolex service process involves making it as close to like new as possible. Now, sometimes that means replacing the dial and hands, and that's up to the customer. And so in some cases, I was just doing repair and service. In some cases, especially the laser welding cases, that was a restoration, right? Now in the shop here, I don't like to restore vintage watches because I think there's so much history and charm in a watch that has patina, that's got a faded dial. The lume is all, custard colored instead of the bright white tritium. So I don't really do a lot of restoration here, partially because I like to keep vintage watches in their original condition, and partly because I don't have the equipment set up to do restorations. I don't have polishing, lapping, laser welding. It's just me in this one spare bedroom in my house that I've converted to a workshop. I've got a lathe. I've got I've got a cleaning machine. I've got a workbench. Got everything I need to do repairs. But restoration is just it's a whole nother level of things that quite frankly, I don't have time to engage in for the most part. That being said, every now and then I will take on a job that is a little bit more in the restoration side of things. For example, right now I have a ladies' Vacheron from the 1920s, and the movement was just destroyed. Someone had removed a lot of the decoration, damaged a lot of screws, scratched a lot of the bridges. So I'm doing kind of a light restoration on that one, but I'm not I'm not refinishing the case. I'm not refinishing the dial or anything. It's a little bit of a blend between restoration and repair. So
do watchmakers ever subcontract? Do you ever find specialists and be like, I don't do dials, but I know this person that does. I'll have them do that part.
Yeah, there's a lot of companies that are just they just do one thing. I've had some watchmakers reach out to me to subcontract. Again, that's something I've said no to a lot. But there's some watchmakers who will I know someone who just does balance staffs. Like that's all they do. People send them watches that need a new balance staff, whether it's a balance staff that needs to be made or just, found and replaced, or they find something that can serve as like a basis and then they modify that staff to replace the staff. They do just that, charge $100 an hour, and then send it back to the watchmaker. Now, I can replace a balance staff myself, so I haven't needed to use those services, but there's a lot of that in this industry. There's dial specialists, there's staffing specialists, there's people who do just movements, just this, just that, just cases. There's tons of collaboration in this industry.
One of the things I'd like to ask your opinion about, and again, I know that there's going to be a lot of depends, but we're going to try to push people in that direction, is how to respond to the scenario of I need my watch fixed. I know it sounds simple, but even myself, but a lot of people, they need something fixed and they're just sort of, it's not that there's too many options. They don't really know what to do first. Mm-hmm. Yes, you can go to the brand, but they all hear stories about how that can be crazy expensive. There's independent people out there. It's like they don't know to send the watch somewhere else because you can do that. Find someone around town. Talk through some of the more common scenarios and make your recommendation for how to find someone to repair this, and then maybe when not to do it. When to say, I don't think this is the right type of place for that. But I noticed that a lot of people are very confused and anxious, understandably anxious about these things. What kind of advice can you give and detail a few different scenarios?
Sure. So I would always suggest that if you feel uncomfortable or slightly on edge or nervous or anxious about a particular option, don't go with that option. Find something else. I think that's a good rule of thumb, is just trust your gut. Now, for different scenarios, if I have a modern luxury watch that I need to have serviced, I would either send it to the brand in certain cases, or I would send it to most likely an independent watchmaker or independent service center that has a parts account with that brand.
How would you find that out? You have a modern luxury watch. You want to explore your options. You don't want to just go to the brand. How do you know if an independent service center is even qualified to work on that? Is that public information? Do you have to call and ask?
So sometimes you can call and ask, and that independent watchmaker will tell you, yes, we have a parts account with Swatch or Richemont or whoever. Sometimes they're not allowed to say, which is kind of silly to me. But generally speaking, just calling and asking and verifying can get you a lot more information. Sometimes they advertise it. Like, for example, Zimmerman Watch Repair is a company that I have a lot of respect for. I hold them in high regard. They are an independent service center for Omega, for Moser, and I think there's a handful of other brands they work with, but they really advertise Omega and H. Moser. That's kind of their bread and butter. So if I had a Moser that needed service, I'd send it to Drew at Zimmerman. If I had an Omega, I would consider Drew or a Omega AD with an in-house watchmaker, because I know they have a parts account. If they're local, I can always, speak to the sales representative, keep tabs on where that watch is. Whereas if I send it to a service center, maybe they'll do a great job servicing it, but I won't hear an update for months until it, comes back. As far as vintage, I'm kind of in the boat of find a specialist, find someone who works on vintage watches, because there's a lot of people who say they work on vintage watches, but don't really, like, vintage watches take a lot more work and care than modern watches for a handful of reasons. But even within the vintage niche, there's other niches. So like maybe I have a vintage chronograph. Well, I'm going to find someone who specializes in servicing vintage chronographs. If I have a vintage Omega, I'll find someone who specializes in vintage Omega. And that can be tricky. But another rule of thumb I like to follow is always make sure that they have professional education. See if you can find examples of their work. See how open and honest they are about showing the process. Right, like, do they share pictures with their clients? Do they share exactly every step of the process? I think there's a lot of service and repair that goes on that is not quite as thorough and detailed as the the watchmaker advertises. So finding someone who is open about their process, shares pictures and videos with the clients or with social media, I think that can be super helpful. But really, you gotta find someone that specializes in that type of work, whether it's modern luxury, whether it's modern entry level, like there's people that specialize in Seiko, there's people that specialize in vintage, and then specific brands, specific styles of vintage. Maybe you find someone who is really good at servicing bumper movements. So you've got an automatic bumper that you need to get serviced. If that's their specialty, great. But there's so many niches within this industry, and there's professional watchmakers who have kind of found themselves in each of those niches. And then there's your everyman who says, "Oh, well, I can service everything." If a watchmaker doesn't know when to say no, that's probably a bad sign.
Yeah, I agree. The watchmaker who has too much confidence is not the watchmaker for you. In fact, they should be concerned the entire time. In terms of price, is it generally the same, or is it quite different between a brand and an authorized dealer who has a parts account with a brand?
Yeah, so I'll just speak to my experience as a in-house watchmaker for a Rolex authorized dealer. The pricing structure that we had was exactly the same as the pricing structure would be at the other AD in Fort Worth, or at an AD in Los Angeles, or at an AD in New York, or at the service center. So Rolex was very picky about who charged what. That doesn't necessarily mean that all of the ADs follow that structure, but the goal was to have a very, very comparable experience, no matter what authorized service facility you took your watch to. And that may be, I don't have experience working at an authorized dealer for other brands, but I suspect it's pretty comparable.
What else do you want people to know about watchmaking before they go through the process? Obviously, you can't always reverse bad work. Of course, a lot of things can be replaced if there's a serious problem. But I want people to fix their watches, but I don't want people to have a bad experience, whether it's shoddy work or too expensive. What are just some of the first things someone should think, even if you've gone through this process, but like, what is the basic steps you recommend people take to get the watch they have repaired? I think finding a specialist who does that thing, obviously that's really good advice. There's really no generalist, but just because it's such an important area, what else would you tell someone who's about to go through this process?
I would say don't rush the process. Watch repair that is good, good service takes time. There's been watches that, whether it's for parts or for the repair getting more complicated, or and when I say more complicated, I don't mean like I cause a problem, although mistakes do happen. A lot of the time you'll start a job and then provide an estimate and then get into the job and recognize, oh, there's another problem that I didn't catch in the first estimate, so I've got to go back to the customer, tell them it's going to take a little bit more time, tell them it's going to cost a little bit more. So my advice is, don't rush the process, because good watchmaking takes time, and don't cheap out on the process, because good watchmaking is expensive. If you want your watch serviced properly, it's going to cost good money. It's just, there's no two ways about it. The labor is expensive, the parts are expensive, the equipment is expensive, the expertise is expensive. It is expensive. I'm not trying to, I'm not going to try and pretend that, I charge the best prices in town. I charge what I believe my work is worth. If you disagree, that's totally fine. I've got plenty of work. But a good watchmaker is not going to, say, oh, $100, I'll do a complete overhaul, clean it, strip it down all the way to the plates, and replace. Like $100 will not get you a good complete overhaul. In my professional experience,
I just look at it in trying to explain the number of hours. People tend to understand that, right? Like,
sure,
if you're going to be putting 10 hours into something, $100 is clearly not enough money for anyone to take that seriously. No. So I think that's when I try to explain. If it's a simple task that takes 5 minutes, then no, you don't need to be spending $1,000 on it.
Sure.
So I think that's probably the best way for people to think about it. Think about, a reasonable hourly rate and what this type of work costs to get done properly. It's not that watchmakers are slow. It's that even simple tasks have many different processes, many steps, and all those steps take time if you want people to do it in a way where it's not scratched, it doesn't break, they actually check to make sure it's working, they actually time it. A lot of people I know complain to me about this one situation. Obviously, every instance is different, but the complaint is the same. And I'm wondering, maybe you could explain what's going on here. And it's essentially this. I sent my watch in to be repaired. I explained to them exactly what the problem was. It's, usually a hand not lining up or something not being accurate. They did something. They said, "Thank you, sir. Your watch is fixed now." They send it back. And immediately upon inspecting it and using it, the problem is the exact same as it was prior to them sending in. What is going on, and why is this story so common?
That's a great question. I could not tell you. If a customer sends me a watch,
you've heard this as well, right?
I've heard this as well. And in my professional experience, if a customer sends me a watch and they have a specific complaint, I'm either going to fix that issue or tell them why it can't be fixed. Like, for example, if the date is jumping, if they've got a watch and the date is jumping 10 minutes before midnight, well, that should be an easy fix. So if I make the adjustment and now the date is, when it leaves my shop, if it's jumping at midnight, great. If it gets back to them and it's jumping before midnight, something changed, and I'll take it in for warranty work, but if the hands aren't aligned, if the date is jumping at the wrong time, that's usually something that a good watchmaker fixes as a compulsory part of every service. Like when I install the dial and hands, the date's going to jump within a minute or so of midnight every time, unless that watch is not designed precisely. Like if that movement is not a precise enough movement that it jumps consistently at the same time every 24 hours, well, then maybe it'll be right on midnight one night and then a couple minutes before and then a couple minutes after or whatever, but it will be in an acceptable range. If you send a watch to a watchmaker and say, "Hey, I have this specific problem that I would like fixed," and they either straight up don't fix the problem or don't say, "Hey, I can't fix the problem and here's why," then look elsewhere for watch repair. I would say that would be my 2 cents.
Is there any recourse, right? Because I think oftentimes people even pay for this. Is there any recourse when they say we did something and you're like, but it's like if I went to the doctor and I told you my issue is and you prescribed something completely different, like, is there any way of saying, but you didn't do anything?
I don't know. It will depend on it'll vary case by case. But generally speaking, if you're going to send your watch off for repair, if that repair is not under warranty by that watchmaker, I would go elsewhere because that's really the only recourse that the customer has is, look, I sent this watch to this guy and this guy didn't fix what I asked him to, and it's under warranty, so I'm going to send it back and hopefully he'll fix it this time. If the watchmaker doesn't believe in their work enough to put it under warranty, that's not a watchmaker worth trusting. Every job that I send out is under warranty. And if there's an issue that I wasn't able to fix, whether it was because I didn't have access to parts, I told the customer what it would cost and they said, "Nah, that's too expensive," or whatever reason, if there's some reason that I can't guarantee, timekeeping, water resistance, power reserve, whatever, then that will be omitted from the warranty. And I will communicate that to the customer very clearly before I send the watch back to them. But if a watchmaker is not willing to cover their work under warranty, I would not trust that watchmaker.
When you talked about that repair, so to say, being within parameters, it reminded me of the situation with Seiko, where if you looked at their published parameters for movement accuracy, it was like terrible. And you're like, why would you advertise that your watches are so inaccurate? But people didn't realize it's so that if you complained about it, they could say, "Oh, well, it's working within parameters."
Right.
Right? It was just a shield. Yeah, it was a tolerance. So it's funny, right? Doesn't match what consumers think is acceptable.
Oh, definitely not. But then, on the flip side, if you're going to buy a $500 mechanical watch and expect it to keep the same time as a Rolex, it's not going to. Can you adjust a Seiko to keep really good time? Yeah, for sure. I've adjusted Seikos to run pretty dang close to Rolex tolerance, if not in Rolex tolerance. But the thing about some movements in the kind of entry-level price range is that the components are not machined to as precise of a tolerance as those higher-end movements. And so things can shift, things can change over time. And so a watch that leaves the shop running plus 2 seconds a day might arrive to the customer, and because it went through a really heavy shock and incurred damage during the shipping process, well, now it's maybe running 20 seconds fast or 20 seconds slow a day, even though it was like right on when it left the shop. I've had that experience with quite a few Seikos recently. I hate to say it because I love Seiko's got a really special place in my heart. I love Seikos, but a lot of the modern movements have been having a lot of timing issues where the timekeeping changes after just the lightest of shocks. So that's kind of disappointing, but it's just.
No, that's actually interesting you brought that up, because one of the final areas I wanted to chat about was modern watchmaking. And I'll begin with my theory, and you could tell me if my theory is true or not. I really don't know. Mm-hmm. So let's begin with sort of the 1990s and the 2000s. This was taking traditional watchmaking and adding a lot of modern things to make it better, right? So they took the mechanical movement and they improved a lot of areas, and sort of across the board, movements seemed to be great. They were made with good base materials. They had good tolerances. Yes, there was exceptions for some of the new mechanisms that weren't tested, but like your basic automatic movement, time only, chronograph, whatever, like you could make one that was amazing. And even at low prices, the performance was really excellent, really the type of thing you had to pay top dollar for a few generations previous. Now, I think something different has happened now. And rather than modern watchmaking staying consistently good, while there's still a lot of very good stuff, there's this new crop of movements which is born of the idea that, wait a minute, these are just mechanical watches. These are toys. No one really needs them to be that accurate. As long as they sort of work, we don't really have to make sure that they're that precise or tell time well. They're showpieces that people are wearing, even especially the complicated ones or the ones that don't tell time in a standard, two-hand, 12-hour way. So my theory is that because of the demand for lower-priced mechanical watches, there are now multiple companies that have movements that look good on paper, like they have good tech specs, but they're just not that high quality. And whether it comes to staying on time, environmental resistance, things like that, because this is seen as like a hobbyist thing, like a toy, like not really a professional thing, there is now a difference between those movements that are designed to actually work well and be the workhorses, so to say, and those which, again, they look good on paper, they got the tech specs, they look nice, but living with them each day, you're going to find they're not going to be that accurate. The parts are going to wear quickly. So my theory is that right? Is there a bunch of modern kind of crappy movements because of the demand for them?
So I think you're absolutely right that the demand has skyrocketed. And I think as a result, a lot of the time, the quality, whether that's because of manufacturing tolerances, materials, or material processes, has the quality has suffered in an effort to keep up with demand or to cut costs.
Or to keep costs down. Look, you're an indie watchmaker. Sure. You try to buy movements from Edda, they're not going to sell it. Solida, right. But you have to wait. Minimums, it's going to be expensive. Japanese ones, sure, they'll be happy to sell to you, but also minimums, wait lists, and pretty expensive. Eventually, you'll find someone that like, oh, we're a new company, and we want clients like you, and we'll sell you a low quantity. And then you get this stuff, and sometimes I think to myself, it's, what I'll call toy grade, not really professional grade.
And there's, as a watchmaker who has serviced, hundreds and hundreds of watches, it's not this decrease in quality is not isolated to those lower tier entry level brands,
really,
or entry level movements. There's cost cutting in all of the big name high end brands.
I see.
I'm not gonna throw out names out there because I have a lot of respect for the Swiss watchmaking industry and a lot of those brands, and the companies that I have serviced watches for, either directly or independently, whatever. But The one thing in particular that I really have noticed like a stark contrast in between, watches from, the 80s or so, even the 70s, and modern watches is the hardness of the steel in particular, is much different. So it's
gotten softer in some of the crappy ones, right?
So the older watches, even in high-end watches, a lot of the older watches would use fully, heat hardened steel, right? There's a heat hardening process where you get the metal to glowing, like the Curie point. It gets as hard as it possibly can be, tempered? And then they temper it down to the hardness that they need it. And that heat treating process hardens the entirety of the metal, right? All the way through the metal. Whereas modern processes oftentimes forego that and instead have a chemical hardening process that creates basically a hard outer shell. But as soon as that outer shell is worn through, it's super soft. It's like basically like 1 or 2 steps up from brass or copper. It's very, very soft. Well, copper's harder than brass, but it's not as hard as steel should be for a pivot of a wheel or a balance wheel, balance staff or oscillating rotor. Whatever the component is, the steel is not as hard as it should be because of this chemical heat treating or this chemical hardening process rather than a heat treating tempering process.
Yeah, understood.
So that's like the biggest, to me, that's the thing that I see the most often where I'm like, man, this problem that I'm having to charge however much to repair could have been completely avoided at the point of manufacturing if they had used a stronger material, used a better material. And then another thing that I'll speak to briefly is the difference between perceived value and actual value. There's a lot of very high-end brands that have a really high perceived value, but aren't, they're not actually doing the traditional watchmaking that they like to advertise. And I think I'll shout out Peter Elliott Glom, who's a really, really wonderful independent watchmaker working out of Hong Kong. He's making an Instagram series right now of the process that he's going through to make an independent watch by hand, at least in part. Like the bridges and the main plate have been machined via CNC. Everything else he's doing by hand using traditional methods. And so I think if people really want to see what goes into a traditional handmade watch, I think Peter Elliott Glom on Instagram is a great resource to see that. And he's very open and honest about the difference between what he does and what a lot of the luxury watchmaking companies that try to they like to advertise this, traditional handmade watchmaking, but it's not really the case.
That's so interesting. I'm going to have you back on the show if you'll come back to talk more about some details of watchmaking, because we could get into that. We barely scratched the surface. Before we end, just let everyone know where they can learn more about you and find your content on the internet.
Sure. So I'm on Instagram as Garrin the Watchmaker, and you can find my content there. I have a YouTube channel. It's not super active right now. Once I took the teaching position, that kind of took up all the time that it takes to make YouTube content. But most of my stuff is on Instagram. And if you want to learn more about watchmaking and becoming a professional watchmaker, you can go to parisjc.edu/watchmaking. And that's the page on the Paris Junior College website about the program that I run.
And just remind everyone, what city is that in?
Paris, Texas.
And what major city is that next to?
Close to Dallas. It's about 2 hours east of Dallas.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Most of the listeners will associate Paris with a city in a different country.
Yeah, I'm still getting used to saying Paris Junior College and having to clarify that that's Texas and not France. But I'll get it one day.
In this industry, that's one of the slight clarifications you need to make.
It's an important clarification.
This has been the Superlative Podcast interview with Garrin Fraze. Garrin, thank you so much.
Thanks, Ariel.